Some stories are just so gruesome, so dark, they feel more like a legend than actual history. Well, today we're diving into one of the absolute darkest. We're talking about Countess Elizabeth Báthory. She was a Hungarian noblewoman whose obsession with staying young, well, it allegedly led to the murder of hundreds of people. So let's peel back the layers and find the real woman behind the terrifying myth of the Blood Countess. Okay, so to really get this story, we're actually going to start at the end. I want you to picture this. It's December 1610, the dead of winter. We're at this gloomy, isolated castle in what's now Slovakia. A group of investigators, they're about to bust down the doors. They're finally acting on these horrifying rumors that, honestly, people have been ignoring for way, way too long. And the very first thing that hits them, it's not something they see, it's a smell. This quote right here, it tells you everything you need to know. This wasn't just a standard investigation. No way. The air itself was screaming that something absolutely monstrous had happened here. So, what exactly did these investigators, led by a guy named Georgi Thurzo, find inside? Well, it would become the stuff of nightmares, the very foundation of Bathory's legend. It was, and I'm not exaggerating, a castle of horrors. The scene they walked into was just immediate and absolutely sickening. They found bodies that were still warm. Think about that. The killing had been going on right up until they arrived. Then there were dismembered remains, arranged in these bizarre, almost ritual-like patterns. They found a giant silver bathtub filled with fresh blood, and maybe the most damning piece of evidence of all, Bathory's own personal diary, where she'd carefully written down the details of her crimes. Which brings us to the big question, right? How does a woman born into incredible wealth and power become this? How does a noble become a monster? Well, to figure that out, we have to go back. We have to look at the world that made her. See, Elizabeth was a Bathory, and in Hungary at the time, that name meant everything. They were massively powerful, unbelievably rich, the whole shebang. But all that power came with a dark side. To keep that power and wealth in the family, there were generations of inbreeding, which was pretty common for nobles back then. And that led to a family tree riddled with, let's just say, problems. Mental instability, explosive tempers, and some really sadistic tendencies. You could say the seeds of her cruelty were planted way before she ever took her first breath. And her life, it was just one escalation after another. When she was only 11 years old, she supposedly watched a man get stripped naked and left outside to freeze to death, and she was fascinated by it. At 15, she marries this legendary warrior, the Black Knight, and you'd think maybe he'd straighten her out. Nope. He actually taught her new torture techniques he'd picked up on the battlefield. But the real game changer was 1604. Her husband dies. Suddenly, she's 44 years old, a widow with more money than she knows what to do with, and total freedom. And that darkness inside her, there's absolutely nothing left to keep it in check. So with nobody to stop her and this growing terror of getting old, her private hobbies, they spiraled out of control. It became a full-blown, systematic killing spree. And it was all because of this one single, grotesque idea. The legend says it all started with a slap. A serving girl was brushing her hair, pulled a little too hard by accident, and Bathory just lashed out, hit her so hard that the girl started to bleed. A few drops of blood landed on the Countess's hand. And in that moment, she became totally convinced that the skin where the blood touched looked younger, smoother. Now, whether that was real or just in her head, it doesn't matter. That one moment sparked an obsession that would take over her entire life. And from there, she developed this horrifyingly methodical system. This wasn't just random, chaotic violence. Oh no, it was a process. First, you lure young peasant girls to the castle, promising them a job. Then, you torture them, because in her twisted mind, she believed their pain and terror would purify their blood and make it more potent. After that, you collect the blood. And finally, you get rid of the bodies, bury them, throw them in the river, leave them in the woods, whatever it took. And here's the thing. She wasn't doing this all by herself, not even close. She had a whole inner circle, a team of accomplices who made this entire horrifying operation possible. You had Daria, an old woman who was her advisor on all things witchy and magical. There was Janos, her personal executioner. Ilona was the one who went out and found the victims, lured them in. And Catalin was the washerwoman, who had the grim job of cleaning up the mess. This was a full-on conspiracy, and it's how she got away with it for so long. And for almost 6 years, it worked. She got away with it. Why? Because, tragically, nobody with any power cared about a few missing peasant girls. They were considered disposable. But her obsession kept growing, and that led her to make one huge, fatal mistake. So, Bathory starts to think that the blood from peasant girls just isn't cutting it anymore. It's losing its potency. She decides she needs an upgrade. She needs better blood. The blood of young noblewomen. And that, right there, was the beginning of the end for her. Because unlike the peasants, these girls had powerful families. Families who noticed when they went missing after a trip to the Countess's castle. Families who demanded answers and had the influence to make people listen. That's what finally kicked off a real investigation. So just how many people are we talking about here? What was the final body count? Well, during the investigation, witnesses claimed the number was just staggering, as high as 650 victims. Now, the official records from her own diary, they only confirmed about 80. The real number? We'll probably never know. But either way, that puts her in the running for one of the most prolific serial killers in all of human history. But here's a twist. Despite all this overwhelming evidence, her noble status meant she couldn't be put on public trial and executed. It would have been a huge scandal, a dangerous precedent for the other nobles. So the king had to come up with something else, a punishment that was, in its own messed up way, just as cruel as her crimes. Her sentence? To be walled up alive inside her own castle. Masons came and literally bricked up the doors and windows to her rooms, sealing her inside. She was left in total darkness, completely alone, with just a tiny little slot for food and water. She was condemned to live out the rest of her life in a tomb that she had, in a way, built for herself. And she survived like that for almost 4 years. Imagine, the woman who was obsessed with her own face, terrified of losing her beauty, was now trapped in pitch-black darkness, left to rot. Guards would report hearing her talking to herself, screaming at what they assumed were the ghosts of her victims. And the irony is just perfect, isn't it? The woman who killed hundreds to cheat aging and death ended up dying all alone, a prisoner inside the very same walls that had concealed her horrific secrets. But her story doesn't end with her death. In a way, that's where her other story begins. This is the point where the historical monster starts to transform into a supernatural legend. And, the myth she became might just tell us more about ourselves than it ever told us about her. So really, we're left with two different Elizabeth Báthorys. On one hand, you have the historical woman, a deeply disturbed sadistic noble whose absolute power meant she could literally get away with murder. Her real story is a terrifying lesson in what happens when power goes completely unchecked. But then you have the legend, the Blood Countess, an icon of Gothic horror. Over the centuries, her story got twisted, exaggerated, and eventually became the main blueprint for the female vampire we all know today. And that leaves us with one last, kind of uncomfortable question. Okay, her methods were obviously monstrous. But her motivation? That deep, desperate fear of getting old? That's a fear our world is intimately familiar with, isn't it? We've just found, let's say, more socially acceptable ways to deal with it. We live in a culture that's obsessed with youth, that sells us a million products to stop the clock, that treats aging like it's a personal failure. So is the core of her madness really that far removed from our own world? Her vanity led to unbelievable cruelty. Ours just fuels a multi-billion-dollar industry. Maybe the only real difference is the scale.